Duelists are by far the favorite pick when it comes to Valorant ranked. Over 1/3 of people lock in duelists on average, and there are most agents in the duelist category. But how many times do you have a duelist on your team that ends up playing away from the rest of the team, waiting for kills, and not saying a single word the entire game? Or quite the opposite, where your duelist is literally running it down into the enemy spawn every round with nothing to support them. It's an important role, not to mention the one with the most eyes on it. But what exactly makes a good duelist? And is something that could fit into your own ranked games? Hey guys, it's Konpeki here, and in this video, I'll be breaking down what makes a good duelist, as well as what you need to focus on if you want to win more of your ranked games while playing the role. But real quick, if you'd like more personalized help to rank up and your rank is at least silver, me and my team of Radiant and VCT coaches can help you rank up 500 RR in just 10 weeks, guaranteed, or you get your money back inside the Immortal Roadmap program. You'll be getting over 100 hours of personalized coaching with hands-on drills, scrims, and one-on-ones to make sure you learn everything you need to hit Immortal Plus. So if you're serious about putting in the work to see results like some of our players, and you want to work with world-class coaches like Milan, who won champs in 2021, click the link in the description below to book a free call with me or one of our coaches to see if we'd be a good fit. And hurry, because we just opened up signups for the next season of the program and limited spots fill up fast. Now, back to the video. There are currently 7 duelists to choose from, each with their own unique strengths, weaknesses, and overall playstyle. Therefore, every duelist works a bit differently, but they can be categorized into 2 main styles. So before I dive straight into what makes a good duelist in general, I think it's helpful to first go through the 2 main types of duelists that are currently in the game. First up, you have entry duelists, which will also be the main focus later on this video, as they best fit the duelist idea that most people probably already have in their minds. In general though, these are the duelists with strong entry type abilities, mainly those that close the gap on the enemy and make it hard for enemies to deal with you as you move forward and take lots of space. To name some examples, Jet with her dash and or updraft into a smoke, Neon with her sprint, slide, and wall, and Raze with her satchels. These duelists are ideal to go in first and create space for the team using their abilities and putting heavy pressure on the enemy's site hold. That's why you see entry duelists on almost every single team comp in ranked and professional play. And you'll see supporting agents playing around the entry duelist to ensure duelists can secure kills and space for the team. But that's not all there is to these entry duelists. Because alongside having very strong entry power, these duelists also excel at pushing onto powerful angles with the operator and taking risky fights on angles that other agents usually can't take. Because of abilities like Jet Dash and Neon Sprint, entry duelists can take early fights and are able to disengage much more quickly with also much less risk than, let's say, Astra, for example. I'll go into a lot more detail later on, but first let's cover the other duelist type, secondary duelists. Secondary duelists are exactly what the name suggests. They often are the second player to go in right after the entry, and they often do not have the movement utility to help take space as much as the main entry duelist. The main agents that fit into this category are ISO, Reyna, and Phoenix. Unlike entry duelists, they have slightly more supportive utility, but at large, still maintain self-sufficient abilities to help win more of their duels. For example, Reyna has flashes to help her and her team take fights and enter onto sites, but she also has a dismiss to disengage and take more aggressive duels. Or ISO, he has a shield to win duels on his own, but he also has initiator-like utility with his undercut, making enemies vulnerable, and his wall that also helps him take some space. And Phoenix is not much different with his flashes, wall, and molly, which he can either use selfishly or for his team, depending on the situation. Although all these agents would struggle to take space as well as Jet, Raze, or Neon, they're still very good at taking one-on-one fights while also being able to support the entry duelist with their utility. Now, you might have noticed that I've only listed 6 out of the 7 duelists so far, which brings me on to my next point, Yoru. Yoru is the most versatile duelist when it comes to how he can use his utility, playstyle, and options when fighting. This makes him a bit of a hybrid who can take on both roles. When acting as the entry duelist, Yoru can use his TP to close the gap between him and his enemy. Then he can throw a flash to support himself, with even a clone to use as a distraction if needed. He can do this alongside other entry duelists or be supported by an initiator and play as the only duelist on the team. Or if Yoru wants to act more as a support, you can use his teleport as a tool to disengage and use his flashes to support the entry duelist going in. Overall, he's the most flexible duelist, and if you're looking to learn a second duelist to add to your agent pool, Yoru is a great option. Now that we've got a good base understanding of the types of duelists and how they function, we can focus on the most common playstyle of a duelist, being an entry. So what makes a good entry, and what do you need to focus on to improve? The deciding factor of the majority of rounds is which team gets the opening kill, and therefore it is arguably the most important job of duelists to go and get one. In order to get an opening and get away with it though, good duelist players need to have exceptional skills when it comes to isolating fights. If you're peeking 3 enemies at once, you're never going to be expected to get a pick and get out. In fact, bearing extreme whiffs, it would be surprising if you even managed to get one. Of course, just isolating a duel doesn't guarantee victory, but it does mean that in the worst case scenario, your teammates have a much better chance of trading you out as well. Therefore, one of the first and the most valuable tips to be aware of is making sure you are isolating fights with the enemy. One of the biggest misconceptions duelist players have when looking for an early fight is a brute force mentality, where they need to fight one angle no matter what the situation is. When swinging into the enemy, it is important to make sure you are clearing angles slowly instead of going completely wide. Not only does this ensure that you won't be swinging into like 5 enemies at the same time, but it also allows you to keep your crosshair exactly where you're swinging instead of having to flick and make adjustments when swinging wide. Using this trick alongside the utility that entry duelists have to get out, such as jet dash, you can easily isolate fights and disengage quickly, which increases your chances of successfully getting a first blood. Once you understand how to take fights individually, another thing great duelists need to have an understanding of is how to incorporate your team's available utility into your pushes and plays. This will vary from game to game, but thinking about potentially supportive utility such as flashes, stuns, or reveals can make your life as a duelist so much easier when taking fights. Take the example of fighting for B main on Ascent. Having a flash or stun to fight deep into main early will give you a much more advantageous fight than swinging dry. Therefore, good duelists in ranked have a bit in common with in-game leaders in VCT. Of course, you don't directly lead your team, but a good duelist should be able to communicate their intentions clearly and ask for support where necessary. And guess what? The same applies to enemy util. Making sure that you're playing to avoid the enemy utility as much as possible is important so that you don't get forced back without being able to take a fight. Looking at the enemy team comp and thinking about how their utility can counter you will help you know what angles you might want to avoid and which angles you can exploit to win more opening fights. For example, on the defender side of A Long on Haven, you might want to play back early to avoid the enemy breach stun or Sova dart and look to swing after with your dash popped, securing a kill while avoiding all their utility. Even with this information, a vital part of being a duelist is knowing when and where to take fights. Making sure you aren't running it down or forcing unnecessary fights is extremely important, as you can quickly spiral into feeding the enemy team kills and putting your team in a heavy disadvantage. If the enemy team is putting most of their util to fight for the first angles they clear, you can always play further back and take the fight to them only once they have used most of their util. Now, most of the things we've spoken about so far have been focused on general gameplay and how to take fights compared to other roles. But as much as fighting is important, it isn't just specific to duelists. Looking back at the role of the duelist, they need to be able to make space, and one of the key times this can be applied is during executes. This is where good duelists utilize proper entry pathing to maximize the space they take onto site while avoiding as much of the sentinel's utility and threats as possible. In this section, I'll be running through some different examples of good entry pathing and some rules to follow and be aware of. Depending on the sentinel or enemy team comp you're playing against, you'll need to approach entry pathing slightly differently. Each sentinel has their own strengths and weaknesses, and understanding each one can increase your chances of being able to punish them on site. If we focus on executing into a Cypher setup, the best way to counter him is to path vertically, which specifically applies to Jet and Raze. This way you can avoid ground level tripwires and put pressure on the Cypher while your team scales onto the site and breaks the trips behind you. With Raze specifically, you can even use your paint shells to break a wide area of trips for your team before scaling out. And with Neon, it might be best if you slow down your execute and try to get your team to help you break trips, for example with shock darts, Raze nades, KO knife, or fade utility before you end up scaling out onto site. Now, specifically for Yoru, you can have your clone hit the trip first so you can shoot and break it, or he can teleport past the tripwires, so if you're playing Yoru against a Cypher, consider abusing these mechanics to your advantage. Moving on to Killjoy, Her utility mainly aims to delay the enemies behind the duelist and funnel the enemy into an area where she can fight comfortably. Most duelists are able to run through close mollies initially, but the importance here is slowing down after you get onto site and allowing your team to scale after the mollies run out. For example, this can mean re-smoking yourself after dashing to switch on B to protect yourself, or baiting the mollies with a neon wall before scaling out fully with your team. Killjoy counters non-movement agents the most, but can also play a setup to punish entry duelists scaling fast if you path the same way every time. So changing up your pathing could keep the enemy sentinel from having a read on your gameplay. The big takeaway here though is that even though Killjoy might not be the scariest to you as an entry duelist, you can really ruin your team's push if you ignore the rest of your squad and assume they're going out right behind you. Be a little bit more patient and try to almost divide your push into 2 bursts. For the other sentinels, Sage, Deadlock, and Vice aren't as great at maintaining map control and gaining info compared to Killjoy and Cypher, so they're also played a bit less. But they make up for it with their powerful stalls, which can be easy to deal with if you know how. Once you break a Sage wall, she has 2 slows and that's about it. When Deadlock uses her barrier mesh, she doesn't have much to hold off a push anymore. If you can bait out Vice's wall and wait out or shoot her thorns, she also doesn't pose a big threat. As such, the primary way you deal with these sentinels is by breaking or baiting out their utility and either canceling the hit to potentially re-hit the same site later, or continuing your execute anyway if you expect the enemy rotations to be late. Perhaps it goes without saying, but Chamber isn't that special in the way you deal with him. He has a trip, sure, but it doesn't tend to hold back teams as much as other sentinel utility, and it can be shot relatively easily. The scariest thing about a Chamber though is that he'll usually make an aggressive play at the start of the round, so to counter that, make sure you use some early util, and if the util lands, try to dive the Chamber quickly to overwhelm him. And finally, there's a bit of a pseudo sentinel, which is Viper. And when playing against Viper, the only thing to focus on is when to push out onto site. Viper's heavy stopping power relies on her Toxin and her Molly, so baiting out those util before moving towards an execute, for example, using some utilities such as a nade or wall and executing as soon as her wall goes down, is optimal for punishing a Viper's anchor. Now, I think that should cover everything, so let me know if you have any more questions down in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.